he almost never writes his own story. He takes someone else's work, but interestingly, how can I say, he really does not feel bound to follow it much at all. Like, he'll take something, he'll absolutely hollow it out, chuck away key elements, do what he thinks needs to be done for the story, and that leads to quite a few feuds. When we end up, we won't manage it this session, but when we talk about The Shining, that is one of the famous feuds, and Arthur C. Clarke with 2001.
Interestingly,
a similar one.
Bo was talking to me this morning before we began filming about Stanley Kubrick, and because he was interested in this discussion, and he was saying that he was listening to an interview that Arthur C. Clarke had done about his novelization, because I believe 2001 was conceptualized as a film that Kubrick went to Arthur C. Clarke to help him write, and then Clarke expanded the story, made it a little bit less ambiguous and abstract what happened at the end in his novelization of it. But Clarke was talking about how Kubrick was some kind of mathematical genius, as well as being an incredibly precise and diligent filmmaker. And I've read somewhere that supposedly Kubrick's IQ was something up there like 200. I don't know the accuracy of that, but he was obviously a genius, no matter which way you slice it, especially if somebody like Arthur C. Clarke is saying that he was a mathematical genius of the kind that even he couldn't comprehend when they were discussing some of the more scientific elements of the 2001 story.
Oh, absolutely. He was described by, I want to say Adrian Corey, I could be very wrong on there, but he was described as like an intellectual vampire, that you would meet him and he would just grill you about whatever you were interested in, and the subjects would go all over the place into these really obscure areas. It's like it's prime internet autism, way before the days of that.
He would have been on pole if he was around these days.
Oh, absolutely. You know, he's there before 2001, importing Japanese satellite photography and Japanese technical specifications for rocket models and all that stuff.
And he was quite the innovator. I mean, you mentioned The Shining. That's notorious, as you mentioned, of him having no real respect for the source material that he was working off, to the point where Stephen King absolutely hated it, because Stephen King is screeching, going, how can you have The Shining without the hedge monsters? How can we have the story? And then, of course, he tries to adapt it himself, and everybody goes, this is laughable.
Damn it, I want that spooky haunted fire hose back in stat.
Yeah, how dare he turn this into a story about the horrors of the human condition and a family breaking apart? It's about a haunted hotel, goddammit, says mega genius Stephen King, who is probably at least 3 standard deviations below Stanley Kubrick. But Kubrick on The Shining also innovated with his use of Steadicam technology. From what I'm aware, there are those very famous tracking shots where you get the Steadicam camera operator following behind Danny, and then later in the film following behind Jack as he's traveling through the hedge maze. And as far as I'm aware, nobody had really used that technology before in film, and certainly that was one of the most effective ways to use it. So it wasn't even that he was an innovator, it's that when he got an innovation, he was able to already do incredible things with it to really elevate his films.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, you're so right. That technology had really only just come out. It had turned up in Rocky and I want to say Bound for Glory. But you look at that and you don't think, oh, Rocky, yeah, great Steadicam. Like, it was used in it, but it was not used to the full potential. Whereas Kubrick saw, I've got a Steadicam. I can redesign my entire set around it, and I can do shots that no one else has done. And when I was doing the research for this, I was watching Paths of Glory. How can I forget the name this early on? Paths of Glory. Early on, that trench shot where they're just going through and it's kind of unbroken. I watched that and I thought, oh, this is a dude who wants to make The Shining.
Yes, I was watching that for the first time, as I said, with The Killing, Paths of Glory, and Spartacus. This was my first time watching all 3 of those films. The Killing and Paths of Glory, I thought, were excellent in their own right. Spartacus, I will have to say straight away, I did not enjoy very much. I found it to be an absolute slog. And
Harry, obviously it's terrible.
It's
awful.
As far as I'm aware, Kubrick was somewhat of a director for hire on that one, in a way that he wasn't for most of the other projects he got involved with. A lot of the other projects were films that he was very passionate about, whereas this was Kirk Douglas had worked with him prior on Paths of Glory. They needed a director for the film, so he went, okay, hit up Stanley, he'll do a good job. But it really felt like a historical epic of the kind that any director who was doing historical epics in that 1950s to 1960s period could have done. Whereas Paths of Glory, like you say, Spartacus didn't have that same feeling of innovation in the way that he was doing some of the filming some of the shots. I did find it impressive when there's the scene of the slaves facing off against the Roman soldiers, and there's the big shot of the Roman soldiers all going into formation. And it looked as though that was done, I can imagine at the time, it must have been done practically using actual trained extras moving in formation. That was very impressive, but that was the only real aspect of that film that felt like Kubrick was playing with it and having fun with it the way that he does with other things. But Paths of Glory, when they go over the top and they're in no man's land and you get lots of those POV shots following the soldiers, it really felt like you were on the ground. I was thinking as I was watching that, of all of the historical films set in the First and Second World War up to this point, I can't recall another film before then that had shot the action in such a visceral sense. It really felt like a precursor to the way that Steven Spielberg would do Saving Private Ryan, the opening scene at Normandy. So I thought that was very interesting that even back then he's going like, okay, there's this thing where we could have a steady cam, just a single stationary camera shot panning across as they all go through the field, or we could have all of these interconnecting shots where we get really deep in there in the trenches with them and follow them. We're right behind them, really put the viewer in the shoes of those soldiers as they're...
Yeah, the motion is there, isn't it? You're carried along with them as well. But you have so many chaps that you can sort of focus on, but they're just getting picked off, and it's almost like he frames it so you're like, okay, this is a guy I'm going to watch. Oh, he's gone. And then that one, no, he's gone. It's really subtle how he gets your eyes to follow them and just see them taken out.
Yes, one by one.
Yeah. Yeah, he'd done a technique there where he'd basically got all the, they were German policemen, I believe, playing French soldiers. For some reason, I can't put my finger on, the French authorities were not particularly fond of Paths of Glory.
Really? Well, I can imagine why, to be perfectly honest. Well, that's one of the things, we'll get to it, but I had some questions about the depictions of the High Command and the generals in Paths of Glory, because I imagine, obviously, it was specifically intended to be an anti-war film. So it had a message and it had a theme that it wanted to convey. And I was curious, being that I'm not too much of a buff on the actual trench warfare of the First World War, I'm not entirely sure how accurately the High Command were being depicted or how charitably they were being depicted. I would especially say that the general, the primary general, in that the man who looks like a Bond villain with scarred face, was being portrayed almost cartoonishly evil when at one point he orders his artillery command to fire on his own men to get them to get out of the trenches on this obvious suicide mission.
It's a bit over the line, isn't it?
It felt like it was being a caricature. It fell into the cartoonish depiction. But from my cultural touch points that I have for the First World War, outside of if I were to actually go and watch documentaries like, I think Peter Jackson did that coloured documentary of the First World War. What was it? We Shall Remember Them, or Those Who Shall Be Remembered, something like that.
I haven't seen it.
I apologise that I can't recall the name of it. Outside of that and doing some really intense reading on it, my cultural touch points for that are things like now Paths of Glory, like Blackadder Goes Forth, where the High Command, where the military commanders, the generals, were depicted as cartoonish buffoons or just outright evil in many cases. And I wonder how accurate that is to the realities of the situation. Please feel free to let me know in the comments below if that is how those generals actually were.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.